It is every year my delight and honor to work with the GCSP offering a module in their foresight week on methods. So essentially, I spend an awful lot of my time teaching people how to do foresight and all of the different tools there are to both engage in foresight, strategic foresight in the sense you're talking about it, and what I think of more broadly as future studies, futures research. And I find to myself and my colleagues in Futures and Foresight find ourselves in a very unusual, almost surreal moment in applying methods. Because in some ways, the future or the futures have run so hard into the present that they have shattered the present. And in so doing, the present itself is constantly reconfiguring all of those futures. So my metaphor is everything's up in the air, like it's been tossed up in the air. That's kind of what it feels like to be actively engaged in using futures tools and futures thinking and foresight to help people think through this. So what I'm going to do today is give you two examples of different projects that can do that I'm working on right now, and how they're facing some of these challenges of this unique time that we're experiencing. But I want to start off with sort of one point about COVID-19 itself that in many ways is kind of the heart of our perception of it. We, as human beings, we make sense by telling stories, and that theme has come up a lot. Some of the previous speakers have mentioned it. So we try and tell stories about that encompass some of our uncertainties, that encompass possibilities for the future. When we do that in future studies, we call them scenarios. The difficulty, and so those stories are frequently analogies from experiences we've had in the past. The problem is we do a disservice to the actual issue if we try to understand COVID-19 itself as a disease via analogies. And you have seen that problem in the various messages that have come out of the leadership of the United States over the past 3 months, and the media brouhaha in the US, where people have been saying, well, it's a coronavirus, so it's like a cold. Well, no, it's like the flu. It's like a seasonal flu. Okay, well, maybe it's kind of like the flu of 1918. They keep trying to make analogies. And one of the things that we are finding is that every single day brings us more information about this. So one of the first things I would tell you is don't frame this issue too quickly. To some extent, the more we understand it, the more we see how it is unique and different, the more we will understand it. Another issue that relates to this is the tendency for people to look at the statistics and look at the graphs, because they're scary. Scarier in some places than in others. And what the graphs tend to focus on is who's infected, how many people die, and what do those numbers look like per capita in a country. The problem is that, and this is something we can learn from history, the problem is that epidemics like this, pandemics like this, the question is not just how many people die, it's what is life like for the survivors. And this particular disease is unlike a cold or seasonal flu in that initial understanding of it suggests that for the survivors, recovery may take a very long time. Some people may always have 15 to 20% a decrease in lung capacity. This may have a huge impact on the actual surviving workforce, right? So what's the recovery profile for this is a question you might want to think about asking. And what does that mean, not just for worker productivity and for the economy, but also for the extent to which people will be engaging in society in all the ways they used to, whether that's volunteering, engaging in hobbies, taking their kids for walks, no matter what it is going to have literally a big physical impact that we don't yet understand. Don't frame that too fast by past experience, because this is a novel coronavirus. One of the points I'd like to make, you hear people in future studies and foresight and futures literacy a lot using, and strategic foresight, using the mnemonic VUCA for kind of the complex and chaotic systems in which we are embedded. Volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous situations. Jamé Cassio at the Institute for the Future has recently written a great blog post where he says, maybe we need to update that or add a corollary because it feels like we're more in Banny times than VUCA times. And what he means by that is brittle. Systems are proving to be brittle. Everyone is more anxious. Change is non-linear, and potential impacts are incomprehensible. So your new mnemonic for, your new acronym for the day, from VUCA to Banny. Okay. So I want to talk a little bit about, sort of what futurists do and what we do in future studies and foresight by using the examples of two projects and two quotes. The projects are very different in style and in intent. The first one I'm going to talk about is what you might consider the classic public policy strategic foresight project. And in fact, it is for the European Commission. And what I want to talk about is what happens when you are engaged in a project that is trying to assess a changing context, in this case for research and innovation, globally, while in a situation where, as I said, change has slammed into us and in many ways rendered the present completely chaotic. Now, I will say one other thing about these two projects. They're both ongoing. So essentially, I'm sharing the teaser trailers in movie terms with you. And you can sort of watch this space for the reports that will be coming out of both of these. So the first one, and the first quote, today in, I think it was in The Guardian, Dennis Miller and Yanis Varoufakis were being interviewed or wrote a joint essay on the current global situation. And Varoufakis had this great quote that to me summed up essentially this moment we're in. We are sitting on a saddle point, prepared to tip in either direction, and it is utterly indeterminate which of the two directions we will go in. I'm having a hard time seeing my own slide because there are so many little bits and pieces that Zoom has put up here. So utterly indeterminate which of the two directions we will travel. And I noticed that the first question, Maya Kirkovsky, thank you for asking that question, is post-COVID-19 period intro into the era of no globalism, or on the other hand, on the contrary, beginning of a big society built on mutual aid and dependency. This next slide is for you, Maya. So we are working on a set of scenarios for the EC on research and innovation. And the project, our part of the project, I'm working with my colleagues in SAMI Consulting, is for global and regional scenarios. And so we did the global scenarios first to be the kind of framework, and then worked through the 10 regions of the world. So this is 44 scenarios. We actually did the workshop project in November. Went through a rewrite and revision period just to get the styles right and usable for a lot of policy situations. And we were doing that, yes, you guessed it, in late February, early March. And it got to the point, my hand on my heart, where literally every day for the past 2 months, month and a half, we've been getting up and having to revise our scenarios every single day because of breaking news. Now, sometimes the breaking news just reinforced one of the outcomes. So the great thing is we have tons of live sort of weak signals bursting into strong signals that potentially support any 4 of these scenarios. And exactly that point about, are we going to go towards an exclusionary, nationalist, protectionist, isolationist framework in international relations and in how countries connect to each other? Or are we going to all work together as one planet, as humanity as a whole. And as Varoufakis says, we are literally at the tipping point. Don't know. So in one sense, this is the best of all possible times to be doing foresight. Because when you say to people, everything is uncertain, potentially everything could change, people actually agree with you for once. So that's the upside from a futures perspective. And one of the points of writing scenarios like this is that you try to identify two uncertainties that encompass enough that they do capture key questions, that they identify those saddle points that could potentially tip in either direction. So this is the lesson here is that sometimes even futurists are overtaken by change and by the extent of chaos that change can produce. And so one thing I would say to any of you out there who are listening, anyone who has done strategic work, if you have in the last year written any scenarios, you need to go back and rewrite them, because every single day, the present is changing our futures, our potential futures in interesting ways. Now, the other quote I want to share to talk about the second project is from Ken Stanley Robinson, who is a famous science fiction author and recently found himself on a long planned camping trip that went from, like, I don't know, the first week of May to the second week of May. Went in, there were some, news reports about a virus, came back, and the world was shut down. So, his quote, "The virus is rewriting our imaginations. What felt impossible has become thinkable." And Emily, that it seems goes back to the quote you shared about the implausible or the incredible. I can't remember the exact quote. Now we realize can be possible. So we're getting in a different sense of our place in history. We know we're entering a new world, a new era. We seem to be learning our way into a new structure of feeling. Okay, so that's the second project, and I will wrap up because I know we have limited time. The second project addresses a diametrically different way of engaging with the future, of using futures, of learning futures. The first project is typical. You had a number of researchers, you had a lot of participants, you had a formal structure for creating images of the future for a strategic purpose, for purposes of creativity and critique as well. The second project takes an entirely different tack and says, no matter what analysts come up with as images of the future, which may be helpful, people already have images of the future. All of my colleagues here on the panel, all 140 plus of you, you are already thinking, well, in 5 years, this could be really different. Or, in 5 years, will most universities have collapsed? Will we still have airlines? What will you have images of the future in your head? So another way we can approach the issue of asking what might the future be is to ask all of you to share stories, to share what you now think is thinkable that previously you might have thought impossible. And I would argue that in a time of extreme turbulence, where clear path dependencies are harder to spot, that just as we only understand that what seems to be the randomness that we call chaos actually has a structure, is if we have enough outcome points. In a time of this much turbulence, we will best understand what some futures might be by collecting a myriad of outcome points, a myriad of stories about the future from everybody out there who's experiencing this present and is using their imaginations to explore the future. So, second project, working with Cognitive Edge using their crowdsourcing platform SenseMaker, we are collecting stories from everybody who cares to submit a story, or multiple stories, alternative stories about how you think the future could play out post-COVID, using their online platform, SenseMaker, and that is the URL if you want to contribute a story. So that's two different approaches to dealing with what is a difficult time, even for futurists. What many of my colleagues, we talk about how surreal it feels that everything that we talk about in terms of open possibilities and chaos and turbulence for the future, we're living it. So my concluding remarks, the turbulence of the present is rewriting all of our future second by second. The possibility spaces of outcomes from the chaos of that turbulence are shaped by sensitive dependence on initial conditions. And depending upon your topic, the initial conditions are now, are now, are now. They're every single second is an initial condition. Two last things that came up while people were talking. Post-normal times, a lot of my, the reason I'm drawing in chaos, turbulence, complex adaptive responses to turbulence is because I work with a group called the Center for Post-Normal Policy and Future Studies. Tomas mentioned post-normal science. Led by Zia Sardar, the center is actually working on exploring what post-normal futures would look like. And I highly recommend to you there will be 3 blog posts, but 2 are currently up from my colleagues there, and you've got the URLs. The Post-Normal Perfect Storm in 3 parts that explores COVID-19 and the pandemic from that. And the other thing that we have to remember, as we are all thinking, well, you know, in 5 years, please God, they'll have a vaccine or they'll have treatment, we'll be past this. Yes, in 5 years, we'll be past this. And then, of course, we will face the actual crisis.